Hello and welcome to Varn blog. And this is another solo lecture. I was inspired by listening to the Adam Ragusea podcast. Adam Ragusea is a YouTuber mostly for food, a little bit of food science, very much a modern day Alton Brown figure who used to be a communications professor, I believe at Mercer University in my hometown, which is why I found him. Not many people at the beginning of the pandemic were making interesting YouTube videos from Macon, Georgia. Ragusea and his interesting but typical liberal fashion was going over the problems with code switching while he was teaching people the difference between raising the question and begging the question. Begging the question clearly comes from informal classical logic, kind of 19th century thing about rhetoric, where we acknowledge that a kind of logical fallacy that is a fallacious way of thinking, but does not actually say anything about the truth or falsity of the statement made, emerges, and how that's used to regulate people. It's a kind of what Pierre Badiou would probably call a cultural capital. It's a code. And Ragusea talked about the same thing I used to talk about when I taught this with college students in multiple cultures and in high school. I would say, the way you speak is not wrong. It is the way you speak. It is the consensus of your community. But that people who have power over you, who come from communities with other forms of power, talk differently and more precisely. And so they will say, when you say, well, that begs the question, and you're not using it for the logical fallacy, that you are, of course, uneducated. And thus, because you didn't know the social code, excluded from the group. Ragusea actually, though, talked about a person he knew from Britain who came from the working class in the north and moved into media circles. And her response to Ragusea was, well, that's a middle class framework. To be against teaching the codes because of the privilege the code instantiates. At least the code can be learned with relative ease. You don't even necessarily have to have the money and the resources to get there now. And we'll get back to that because that's going to be important about why things are changing now. You just need someone to teach you the code. You can learn it. Without the code, what do you learn? How can you learn to mix in? And in many ways, this ties to many concepts that we talk about, that a person should know the codes, patterns of thinking, ways of being of many social classes and different identity groups. And to understand that the collective and the aggregate and the individual might all reflect each other, and the collective being the idea of the whole unit, the aggregate being how individuals act together when aggregated statistically, like what are the rules that emerge or the identities that emerge when you just see people interacting on their own, and the individual, who is the individual actor, whose ways of acting are in some ways presupposed upon the other two, the collective and the aggregate. Our incentives are not defined by ourselves. They are both defined by our geography and our sociality, where we are and who we are with. And in language, this is why language codes tell so much. This is why most people know when they're listening to a PMC speaker versus a, let's say, actual bourgeois speaker versus a HR manager versus a equity trainer, etc. These are social codes. The social codes of politeness indicate things. And being excluded or not is based on your ability to have the leisure time to learn them or to have access to people who can teach you. Now, that can be shown as merit. Michael Sandera talks about this in The Tyranny of Merit, because it can seem like we are promoting virtues by doing so. That people have the precision in their language to realize something that might have a meaning specifically in a logical context, but is used generally, although sloppily, in common language. Language and its understanding is not prescribed by dictionaries, but is the social code which people agree to and the meanings which people associate with. You do not have a private language, but language can be talked about as words mean whatever you can get away with the meaning. The signs and the signifiers all have a specific context, etc. Now, you might go, well, Varn, you're always railing against liberal over-focus on this. You're always railing against liberal over-focus on things like cultural norms or changing the codes of TV shows. And the reason why I do is that's just one layer to this. This is not new, by the way. People have known about these different social codes and how to play them forever. And in fact, many debates about meaning in ancient philosophy, whether one's reading the classical Buddhist text of Milindapada or Socrates and Plato, is about how one comes up with the meaning of concepts and what relates to that. Are they forms that exist beyond the self? In which case, the aristocrat who uses the words correctly that correspond to the right form actually knows more. All right? That's the Platonic notion here, that the aristocrat or the philosopher, depending, has the leisure time to contemplate the primary forms, and through that actually is on a higher plane of being. Now, the problems with this are numerous and obvious. How those social forms will. And if you think that that's only a postmodern conception, my friend, both Puranic skepticism and most schools of Buddhism talked about this philosophically. The Milindapada points out that, for example, you can't find the form anywhere. The form is essentially empty and only agreed upon by consensus. The Milindapada breaks down, if you try to find the essence of a cart, you can't find the essence. You only have the constructed concept of a cart, which is necessarily limited and socially constructed in that specific case by its use, not any part of which it has. So, for example, a flat surface with a back is a chair when we sit in it. So it's not the form, but the use, and the use in action that defines it. That's the Milindapada's gambit. Now, this led to all kinds of stuff in the long term of Buddhist philosophy. If you want to get into stuff like Mahayamaka and Yogacara and whether or not the world exists, one finds it actually in this sort of response to essentialist philosophies. But what does that have to do with social codes and virtue signaling and other basics? All right. I talked about code switching. I always taught it as code switching. And I always saw teachers who didn't teach the code switching because they wanted to validate people's class as actually underselling people that, like, no, there are codes. There are class codes. You should be able to change the way you speak to move into them. You should have the adaptability of mind. And there are more than class codes. There are racial codes. There are gender codes, etc. To say these are socially constructed is somewhat kind of to beleaguer a point. Of course, words are socially constructed. Notice how I just said language worked. We know what something means because we agree that it means that, particularly in terms of abstract concepts. And so, certain abstract concepts, many of the things we call virtues, are always contested. All right? What freedom means, what equity means, whether we should focus on one or the other, these are contested concepts. Many people have a tendency to reify them, which is to just assign meaning that is specific. Ironically, even someone as stodgy as good old Aristotle realized the problem with this, which is when he talked about virtues, virtues were defined as what was modeled for you. So getting out of the logical rule that can define all action that presupposes most post-enlightenment philosophy, from utilitarianism to Kantianism, virtue ethics is the ethics of strength, literally what virtue meant, right? In Latin, virtue, right, is related to vitae, even in the blood. So you would pick traits that were associated with admirable characteristics and model the characteristics. This, when abstractified, also came down narratively and was fundamental to many religions. So, for example, to model the virtues of Christian piety was to model yourself on the apostles and the saints. Maybe not Jesus, because Jesus was beyond human, and to be that sinless is not possible for people. But you could model yourself on a saint, on a holy ruler, etc., who had certain traits that were identified, and that was the Christian virtues. Now, that's not unique to Christianity. I want to actually get into that. This is true in the idea of hadith in Islam. The hadith are the stories of the prophet. Rulings about proper ethical behavior is based off of your comportment to the life of the prophet having a most virtuous life, meaning that if you were to mimic virtues, you mimic the prophet. And so the stories which you accepted as legitimate stories of the prophet's life, and thus as models for how you implement and understand Islamic law, Sharia, come from hadith. This is also a virtue system. It's a little bit more complicated because it involves legal rulings as well. Part of the legal rulings is which hadith are valid. So what stories about the prophet can you trust? And that goes into recitations and strings of lineage and stuff like that. This is also important in Buddhism, which has similar strings of lineage, because you had to model yourself not just on the stories of the Buddha, the virtues of the Buddha, but since you weren't as enlightened as the Buddha, you were trying to be, and even if you were, you probably couldn't do it perfectly. You had to model yourself on the lives of the moral stories of the prior Buddha before he became the Buddha. So before he was Siddhartha Gautama, those manifest in Jakarta Kales. On prior Buddhas, which are the stories of the Buddhas before the Buddha, on Arhats and Bodhisattvas, depending on whether or not you're a Theravadan or part of the Mahayana, or any of the other many Nikaya schools that have died out. So you would base your life on the great exemplars, and you would model yourself accordingly, but you also lived according to law. Your understanding of the law had to be traced through a lineage in most Buddhist schools, because they could give you the direct insight through their own personal attainment to give that to you. So you had to find the person who walked the walk to explain to you the meaning of talking the talk. As many people who went to Protestant church know, walking the walk and talking the talk aren't the same thing. And this gets us to something around virtue signaling and code switching and all of this. See, virtues are modeled. You do have to signal them because you are modeling a behavior and a kind of behavior and a virtue system. It's not rule-based in that you find one rule that you can reduce to and generate all your actions off that rule. That's considered a foolhardy goal. After Virtue by Lester McIntyre basically points out that when you establish an impossible rule like that, you become purely emotivist. It's not that McIntyre thinks one can actually be supremely reasonable, but that there is kind of objective standards once you've decided what your models of virtue are. Now, he places those in the Thomistic Catholic tradition because that's the religion he belongs to. But that is the thinking. And the reason why these rational rules lead to emotivism is because the rational rules are impossible. There's no way to always act in accordance to the benefit of all beings, aka utilitarianism, or at least harm, without having to define harm, being, inclusion, etc., in such ways that sneak in emotive categories. So while you're claiming to be rational, you're sneaking in all these other things. Social codes, class codes, etc. The reason why the complaint about virtue signaling, though, is somewhat legitimate is because it's about how people talk the talk, but do not even attempt to walk the walk. Virtue signaling is different from virtue modeling. While you might have to signal a virtue to model it, although the idea is you actually watch people who have the virtue that you define, and that's how you define the virtue, is by watching the people that you think have it. Signaling is like posting about your moral feelings or stances or ideology about something, but it relates back to a code. What you are saying then is you are showing your acceptance to a certain community by signaling that that is what you do. It's a code. Just like the code of acceptable and non-acceptable between class, these moral codes that you signal but don't have to attach much to. The stupid flags on your Twitter icon, your statements about political beliefs, etc., is a signal. Now, if you hear the concept of stolen valor, the problem with virtue signaling is a kind of stolen valor. The conservative mocks the liberal for virtue signaling because what the conservative is saying, in many ways, is you don't practice what you preach because what you preach is impossible. It's not the way the world actually works. So you just signal it. Now, I'm not here to adjudicate between the legitimacy of conservative versus liberal takedowns of this, but leftists and left liberals used to point out virtue signaling in things like politics, where people would say they believed in equity, but then went home and beat their wives. The personal is political. For example, that phraseology in the 60s comes from that observation. To valorize virtue signaling as the prime means of owning the community, of getting into community, means that you just want people to say the right things, to speak the code that shows that they know what your community believes in. You're not even asking them to act in a way or model behavior in a way to belong to that community. So there's a relationship between code switching and virtue signaling, and that virtue signaling is to reduce virtue to a code that you are expressing. Now, how does it get pernicious in terms of class and community? And why does code switching eventually run out, loses its ability to be a class sorter, and what replaces it? Well, the logical implications or the sociological implications of what Adam Ragusio's friend was telling him was that when you remove the social codes that you can learn, speak more precisely, use the right diction, drop and change your accent, etc. And people will notice this in racial coding because people will put on their white voice. But everyone does this all the time, not just racially. You do it between different social groups. You indicate authority and respect this way, etc. The general flattening of social media has changed us somewhat, but we still have these quote discourse communities to which we belong. But these have material implications. Let's talk about a manifestation of virtue signaling that moves from code switching into things that you can't fake as a way to move up class and make class more rigid, even though it seems progressive. The diversity statement. The diversity statement is not a statement about who you are or even your belief. If you watch trainings on it, what you're supposed to do is illustrate that you have devoted much of your leisure time to these causes in an active and considerate way. Know the codes to speak to show that, but also be able to devote the time and have people vouch for you. Now that looks like merit, right? That you are an anti-racist because you've worked this many hours with this much NGO, you've helped the Pride Center in your area do this much, etc. Here's the issue with that. And it's an issue not just pointed out by me. That requires you to have leisure time, know which things are acceptably anti-racist and not, and devote massive amounts of leisure time to it in addition to whatever you need to do to get educated. I'm not the only person who's pointed out that colleges have become less economically diverse as they've accepted diversity statements. Now, this is interesting because colleges have become more racially diverse, but if you accept also that sociologically speaking in the United States, Black people are poorer, how is that happening? And then you look at the statistics, and it says because overwhelmingly, people who can perform these diversity statements come from upper class backgrounds. You see certain ethnicities and immigrant groups disproportionately representative within racial groups. And that's because because of the racistness of many of our immigration laws, that only the very rich from certain places can come over and have the time then to signal correctly, know the right things, and be able to do. So you have a shift from simple social codes to things that require leisure to do. This is why teaching the social codes is actually never going to be enough, because it requires material things to access some of these social codes. And think about it. A lot of these things have been democratized by the internet. Even though I've been talking more and more about how the internet is leading to general illiteracy, and fewer people actually even know these codes, they do have free access to them. But as they have free access to them, you no longer need to know anyone in a specific institution, I need to know the Ivy League, then they lose their value. And you go to either signaling a merit in ways that require you to have leisure time and know how to utilize it correctly, or signaling merit through nepotism. So the virtue signaling is tied to that because you're signaling things, not living them. But often the way you prove that you live them requires a certain amount of class to have the time and access to do. And the old social codes, are the old things that we complain about being bigoted and biased, such as standardized tests, etc., lose their value. And while the elites seem more diverse and have more access to higher education, the wealth gap doesn't change. Now, the wealth gap in of itself has, when we talk about it, has problems when we talk about aggregates like that, because most of the wealth is held, and all races is held by the top quartile of it to such an absurd degree that it skews everything. So when you talk about, for example, the white wealth gap over the black one, you do have to look at things like home ownership or whatever in the average person, and you have something slightly more meaningful and more real to talk about social policy. But even if you address most of that wealth gap would still exist between elites who've had generations to accumulate that wealth. And it doesn't change anything for the average person, regardless of their race, right? But beyond that, that's beyond those statistical realities, that we are moving from a time period where codes were learnable, but they were curtailed by things like credentials and access and education, which required money or knowing the right people to get. We tried to make that slightly more meritocratic through testing regimes and whatever, but the tests have bias is because language has biases in it. Language is defined by consensus social groups, as we just said. So there you go. But as that's been somewhat democratized technologically, like you no longer have to even know how to read particularly well to learn how to change these codes. You can just find the right person on the internet to teach you what a white and black tie is. You also then see that our models for understanding that moved from codes that can be learned and signals that can be easily made to signals that require certain resources to even attempt. So virtue signaling is a rat race, just like code switching is. And as that gets figured out and democratized and people figure out the codes, it either changes, which is why the way we talk about various political codes change so much, and the acceptable language changes so much. Unhoused or unsheltered versus homeless. Now, I don't see homeless as a moral judgment, but unhoused and unsheltered is an attempt to destigmatize it. Now, I can already tell you that destigmatization won't work. It will have to change because the stigma comes from the association. Most of the words, for example, that we now consider ableist or even slurs were themselves a similar euphemism for words that were worse. This won't work. And 10, 15 years ago, it was clear to people that it wouldn't work. I mean, George Carlin used to have rants about how this doesn't work. That the social stigma shifts because the consensus language building moves from, unsheltered. Well, of course, the unsheltered, blah, 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 blah. So you're moving the goalpost constantly. But you're also, in doing that, resetting who can follow and keep up with the community, who's in the right discourse spheres, etc. And some of these are maintained in ways that require you to have elite time and access to do. The people who play video games because they're tired when they get home from work are shut out. Think about that when we talk about these culture war issues and what they're doing on the right and the left, because they're more pernicious than it seems. And while we can complain about what conservatives do, which is vice signal, and I see vice signal as they adopt the opposite values of the people that they hate, so they signal them directly, and it leads into self-contradiction. That's part of the point. These are mutually constructed community patterns and ways of walling off who is okay in what group and how they show it. You need to know that.